What does it mean to be a Western yogi? How can someone who was born and raised in the West, who comes from a Judeo-Christian background, practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way? My name is Christopher Sartain, and this is the Western Yoga Podcast. It's a very rainy day here at our ashram in southern Chile. So if this episode is a little noisy or you hear some rain in the background, don't be alarmed. That's what's going on today. Here in Patagonia, I have to say, even on the rainy days, it's extraordinarily beautiful here, and we are very blessed to be where we are. Is yoga a religion? You might be thinking, who cares? And many people don't really care the answer to that question. However, this is the Western Yoga Podcast. We are here in the Western world. I come from a Southern Baptist background. I attended a Southern Baptist, very conservative Southern Baptist church, fundamentalist Christian church, until I was 15 or 16. Also, I live in South America, which is very Catholic. And Chile, where I live, is a very Catholic country. And so these things are worth discussing for people who come from a Judeo-Christian background, which is still, to this day, the majority of people in the Western world. It is important to note that when I discuss the West, I include Latin America, Central and South America, because it is a huge part of the West, although it is oftentimes excluded when we discuss the Western world. So the West is largely Christian. That is changing, of course, quickly. However, it is still the case as of May 2020, when I'm recording this podcast. And so it is worth discussing whether or not yoga is a religion and how people's opinions about yoga affect its evolution in the West. People in my own family and some of the communities that I've lived in, the towns that I've lived in, and whatnot, many people in those communities and members of my own family consider yoga as another religion and as something satanic. So, for me personally, it's worth exploring these topics. As a matter of fact, I am an ordained minister, an authorized teacher, if you will, in the tradition of Kriya Yoga. I was ordained on July 5th, 2012 by my guru, Roy Eugene Davis, a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda at his ashram in North Georgia. I decided to hide this fact from my family for many years because I was afraid of the repercussions and I was afraid of their reactions. And many of them, many of the people in my family, I'm sure to this day still believe that I'm a member of a cult. So, this is why it's important for us to discuss yoga as a religion or not. because it has an effect on how most Westerners perceive yoga and also how many yoga studios treat yoga in their studios, how they present yoga to the public. In more Christian communities, more conservative Christian type communities and towns, yoga is presented as a type of physical exercise, stretching and breathing and aerobics. Essentially, it's not really all that different than a typical aerobics class that you would attend in a gym. Sometimes the studio owners know otherwise, of course. However, they are forced to present yoga as such in their particular communities so as to not offend the Christian sensibilities of the public where they live. This has had an effect on the evolution of yoga in the West, especially in the United States, where fundamentalist Christianity is still much more prevalent than it is in Europe and even here in Latin America. Although the Catholic Church, especially here in Latin America, is also very conservative, and we do have to be careful not to offend Catholics here in South America as well. So it's been interesting to navigate that here as well. Although I must say it was far more interesting to navigate that in Appalachia, where I used to live. My wife and I opened the first yoga studio in a small Appalachian town in Georgia, and a very fundamentalist Christian town. And that was very interesting to navigate. As a matter of fact, we later heard that there were sermons delivered at local churches about our humble little yoga studio. And preachers were encouraging their church members not to attend classes at our yoga studio. And they were telling their church members in their sermons on Sundays that when you meditate, you open yourself up to demon possession, which is an interesting idea. And a common one, a very popular idea amongst fundamentalist Christians. And it is why they do not include meditation in their Sunday services or as part of their spiritual practices. Although that is changing, which is wonderful to see. My sister, who is the wife of a Southern Baptist youth minister, is now practicing a simple form of contemplative Christian prayer, which is similar to meditation. And that's absolutely wonderful to see that people are beginning to open up, some people. However, the vast majority of fundamentalist Christians still believe that yoga is another religion, that it is satanic, and that it can lead to demon possession, especially the practice of meditation. It's difficult to define religion. How do religions differ, for example, from cults or spiritual philosophies? It's hard to say. I studied Eastern religions at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. And I have to say that many academics and scholars cannot reach much agreement on some of these basic definitions. How does one define a religion? How does one define a cult? How does one define a spiritual philosophy? It's not as easy as you think. As a matter of fact, I would say, and no disrespect to the church that I grew up in, they meant well, and there's a lot of really great people that attended that church. Wonderful people, ethical people, moral people. But I have to say, looking back now, objectively, I have to say that the Southern Baptist Church that I grew up in rural Georgia was more cult-like than the spiritual organization that I belong to now and that my guru founded. So these things are very difficult to define. Some scholars, for example, believe that the Church of Scientology is a cult. Others say it's just another religion. Others would argue that it is simply a spiritual philosophy. However, I will say this. Yoga, at least as I have learned it, and as I can conceptualize it, is a mystical tradition. Now, what does that mean exactly? What is a mystical tradition, and how does a mystical tradition differ from a religion or religious tradition? What is mysticism? Well, mysticism regards experience of the divine as being far superior to beliefs about the divine. Let me explain. A mystic wishes to experience the divine, wishes to have direct experience of God, of the soul, of his or her higher self, whereas a religious practitioner is content to simply believe things about the divine, usually things that are in an old book, like the Bible, the Torah, the Quran. So, really, the difference between a mystical tradition and a religious tradition is knowledge versus belief. My guru said often, don't be a believer, be a knower. Don't be a believer, be a knower. It's better to know something than to believe something, isn't it? So, in a religion, we are taught to believe certain things about God, about the soul, about the afterlife. Whereas, in a mystical tradition, we are encouraged to experience and know God, experience and know our higher self, experience and know what happens when we die. Yoga, as Paramahansa Yogananda and the rest of the Kriya Yoga lineage of gurus taught it, is a mystical tradition. We are mystics. So, is yoga a religion? Well, there are certainly many yoga texts that mention things about the soul, Atman, or God, Brahman, or Ishvara, or Shiva, and the afterlife, and all of these things. And so we could say that yoga does have certain beliefs, a certain belief structure about reincarnation enlightenment, the soul, the divine, and all of these things. Sure, that's true. But it's also true that in the yoga texts, we are encouraged to experience the divine, to know the divine via direct experience. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, for example, that is made very clear. So, yes, yoga does have some religious um, belief structures within its sacred texts. However, it is also a mystical tradition, and so it differs from most religions in that way. However, Christian mysticism has many things in common with the yoga tradition and with Buddhism and other mystical traditions. Therefore, it is important to note that Christianity is not one thing. There is not one Christianity, there are many Christianities. Just as there is not one yoga, there are many yogas. There's not one Buddhism, there are many Buddhisms. There's not one Hinduism, there are many Hinduisms. Okay? So, Christianity also has a mystical branch known now as mystical Christianity or Christian mysticism. And I, to a certain extent, consider myself a Christian mystic. I've studied many uh, texts written by Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart and Saint Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, this famous text known as the Cloud of Unknowing, and the Gospel of Thomas. On this podcast in the future, probably fairly soon, I will do a series of podcasts on the Gospel of Thomas and the mystical teachings of Christ found therein. It is probably my favorite spiritual text, or at least right up there with other texts like the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Zhuangzi, the Tao Te Ching, and others. So, as we can see, yoga does have some of the characteristics of what we would consider to be a religion. However, it is also a mystical tradition. Paramahansa Yogananda always encouraged his followers and students to keep whatever faith and religious tradition they had been brought up with, and he would always say that you can practice Kriya Yoga and you will become a better Jew if you're Jewish. You can practice Kriya Yoga and you will become a better Christian if you're a Christian, a better Muslim if you're a Muslim, better Buddhist if you're a Buddhist, so on and so forth. And my guru encouraged the same. So it is not necessary for us to renounce our religion. We can continue to attend church services or services at the mosque or Jewish temple, what have you, and practice yoga and meditation without any conflict or issues. Because at the end of the day, all of these religions, at their core, really teach similar things, especially when we get into the mystical branches of these religions. In Christianity, Christian mysticism, in Judaism, the Kabbalah, and in Islam, uh, Sufis teach similar things. Okay? So, as Westerners, it's okay for us to keep our religious tradition. It is okay for us to continue to attend church services, things like that, and practice yoga and meditation at the same time. There's really no great conflict there. If you are a fundamentalist Christian, however, you will encounter conflict unless you keep it a secret. um, which you can do if you'd like. You can be a secret undercover yogi. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it's better, to tell you the truth. You don't need to let anyone know about your personal, private beliefs or practices. No one needs to know what you're doing in the privacy of your own home as far as your spirituality is concerned. It's no one's business but your own. So if you prefer to avoid conflicts, if you have a more introverted personality, and you wish to avoid religious debates, conflicts with others, you can simply be an undercover yogi. That's okay. If you, at some point, wish to leave your church, that's okay too. Yeah. But in this Kriya Yoga tradition, it has always been taught that you are free to uh, keep practicing whatever you were practicing before and just add the practices of yoga and meditation to whatever you're already doing, and you will become a better Christian, a better Jew, a better Muslim, a better Buddhist, a better Hindu. Okay? And there's really no conflict that arises out of that. So there are very fine lines in between what we consider to be religions and cults and spiritual philosophies. And these terms are very difficult to define. Some would argue that yes, yoga is in fact a religion. Others would argue that it is merely a spiritual philosophy. And, of course, many would argue that many of the guru sects of yoga verge on cults, verge on being cultish, which is true in certain circumstances. There are, in fact, many personality cults that have arisen out of the yoga tradition, and these are to be avoided. We are never to worship the guru or anyone or anything. To worship something is to acknowledge separation between you and your object of worship. Yoga is union. When we experience yoga or samadhi or this experience of divine union or oneness consciousness, we have the experience that there is, in fact, no subject and object, that there is no separation, that separation is an illusion. So that in order to worship something, we have to admit that there is separation between ourselves and our object of worship, which is, as we discover, an illusion. So worship is not really encouraged necessarily in the yoga tradition. However, if you wish to continue your practices of worship and your rituals and your ceremonies revolving around the ritual worship of a deity, it's okay, but ultimately you will leave that behind, I assure you. And the guru is not to be worshipped. When the guru is worshipped, this creates problems and issues, and it creates a personality cult based around the worship of a person rather than trying to become like that person. Yogananda, none of the Kriya Yoga gurus ever wanted anyone to worship them. They wanted people to be like them. That should be the goal of any spiritual teacher or true guru. A true teacher will teach you how to become just like they are. They have no interest in you worshiping them. That's a very selfish, egocentric desire, isn't it? And one who is enlightened would not have that kind of selfish, egocentric desire, would they? So, I hope that I have covered some of the issues around yoga as a religion in the West, and that I have at least sparked enough interest for you to contemplate some of these things. And by the way, for a yoga studio owner living in a town or community that is more conservative Christian or fundamentalist Christian, it's okay uh, for these studio owners to present yoga as simply a physical practice. There's nothing wrong with that. Earlier, when I mentioned that, I hope I did not sound as though I were judging uh, anyone. It's perfectly all right to do that. If you would prefer to present yoga as simply a physical exercise for health and well being and relaxation, that's okay. Yoga has to adapt itself to the West. It has adapted itself to the West. It is evolving here in the West. Of course, here, yoga is thought of primarily as a physical exercise routine for health and well being, weight loss, possibly, and stress management. That's okay. That's okay. Those things are all good things, aren't they? Health, well being, stress management. Those are all positive ideals. So if there are yoga studios that have no interest in the spiritual practices of yoga, such as pranayama, chanting Sanskrit mantras, meditation, homa, fire ceremonies, and things of this nature, that's okay. Some would argue that, oh, that's not yoga. Oh, that's not real yoga. They're misappropriating Indian culture and yoga in that way. I don't see it like that. If people are stretching and breathing and relaxing, great. That's fine. Those are all good things. Now, there are some ways in which yoga is being presented that maybe aren't so positive here in the Western world. And we'll talk about those issues on future episodes of the Western Yoga Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you subscribe to the podcast and share it with others. Until next time, namaste.